Get your black, wrinkled hands off that paperwork, old man!
Wendell Gar, the county's emergency management director, barked it across the desk, his face twisted up in pure disgust. And before Booker Tate could say a single word, Gar snatched the federal disaster application right out of his hands, tore it clean in half, and shoved Booker's coffee cup off the desk. The cup hit the floor and shattered. Dark coffee splattered across the tile, and the ruined paper soaked it up in the mess.
People like you keep coming in here begging for a free roof, thinking you belong on the high ground. You don't. The math says your house in the bottom isn't worth a single cent of our budget. Now clean this up and get out before I put you where you belong, drowning in your own swamp.
Booker Tate did not flinch, 71 years old, and he stood perfectly still, his big calloused hands hanging easy at his sides, his brown eyes locked on Wendell Gar with a calm, terrifying dignity. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just bent down, slow, and picked up the broken pieces of that coffee cup with his bare fingers. On everyone. Then he straightened back up, and he walked out of that office, out into the storm that was already gathering over the county. Wendell Gar grinned. He thought he had just crushed a nobody. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours, a catastrophic flood would swallow that entire county whole. He had no idea that the most powerful federal disaster official in America, the woman who sat at the very top of the agency that every grant dollar in his county flowed through, would be clinging to the roof of a sinking car in the freezing dark, the black water climbing up around her, screaming into a dead phone for a help that was never going to come. And Wendell Gar had absolutely no idea that the only thing standing between that woman and a cold, watery grave would be the exact same old man he had just treated like garbage. Let's get into it. But before the flood, before the rescue, before the reckoning, you need to understand two things. You need to understand who Booker Tate was, the man Wendell Gar tore up and threw out, and you need to understand why the water came for Booker's neighborhood first, and why that was no accident at all. Because that insult you just watched, that wasn't one cruel man having a bad day. That was 100 years of arithmetic. Said out loud, Hartfield, Mississippi sits in a bend of the Cawood River about 90 minutes north of the coast, in the kind of county that doesn't make the news until it floods. It used to be a paper town. Back in the day, the Calumet paper and pulp mill ran 3 shifts, and the smell of it, that sweet, rote, boiled wood smell, hung over everything, and the people who lived there called it the smell of money. Black men and white men both worked that mill, though they worked different jobs for different pay, and they went home at the end of the shift to 2 different Hartfields, up on the north side, where the land rolled high and dry above the river, was Hartfield Heights, brick houses, paved streets with names like Magnolia and Camellia, a water tower painted fresh every few years. That's where the mill bosses lived, and the bankers, and the county supervisors, and down in the river bottom, in the low ground that flooded every spring, there was the neighborhood the white folks called the bottom and the black folks called home. Officially, on the oldest county maps, it still carried the name Freedmen's Bottom, because that's exactly what it was. After the war, after emancipation, when the freed people of that county were looking for somewhere to put down roots, the only land they were allowed to buy, the only land anybody would sell them, was the cheap land, the wet land, the land nobody else wanted, because the river took it back every few years. So they bought the bottom, they built on the bottom, and for 150 years their children and their children's children lived on the bottom, and every generation watched the water come up into their living rooms. And every generation cleaned the mud off the walls and rebuilt. Because that's what you do. Now here's the thing you have to understand. And it's the thing this whole story turns on. The flooding wasn't fate. It wasn't God. It was a choice. 1,000 small choices made in county offices over 100 years. When the Army Corps built the levee ran along the north bank, protecting the heights. And it stopped. It just stopped. Right where the heights ended and the bottom began. When the county got grant money for storm sirens, they put the sirens up north, on the high ground that flooded the least, and they never ran the line down into the low ground that flooded the most. When the engineers drew up the drainage plans, the bottom was always Phase 2, and Phase 2 never came. For 40 years there had been a study, the Cawood Bottom Flood Mitigation Study. Booker Tate had been to more public meetings about that study than he could count. He had seen it come up for a vote at the Board of Supervisors maybe a dozen times. And every single time, some version of the same sentence got said by some version of the same official. The cost-benefit numbers don't justify the investment, meaning the houses in the bottom weren't worth enough money to bother protecting, meaning the people in the bottom weren't worth enough money to bother saving. Booker had stopped going to the meetings years ago. Not because he gave up. Booker Tate did not have a quitting bone in his body. He stopped going because his daddy had taught him something a long time ago. And it had turned out to be true. Eli Tate used to say, "They are never going to build us the high ground. So we build it ourselves." Elitate. Now there's a man you should know about too. Even though he had been dead since 1981, because half of who Booker was just Eli echoing forward. Eli was born in 1909. He spent 30 years working the rails as a Pullman porter. One of those black men in the crisp white jackets who made up the berths and shined the shoes and got called George by every white passenger, no matter what his actual name was. Also, the railroad wouldn't have to bother learning it. Eli swallowed all of that. Every day. For 30 years. And he sent every dollar home. And when he finally came off the rails for good, he had two things, a back full of arthritis and a head full of plans. And the first plan was the house. Eli had ridden enough rails and seen enough country to understand water. He understood that the bottom flooded not because God hated it, but because of where the water went and where it didn't. So Eli walked every square foot of that neighborhood with a level and a length of string. And he found it. A low ridge. Barely a rise. Maybe 8 feet of elevation that ran along the back of the bottom. That nobody had ever paid any attention to because 8 feet doesn't look like anything. But Eli knew. 8 feet was the difference between drowning and standing. He bought the lot on the rise. He built the house himself. By hand. On weekends and evenings. Over the course of 4 years. And he built it the way a railroad man builds. Overbuilt. Square. Stubborn. He set it up high on piers. He framed it out of heart pine that you couldn't drive a nail into today without bending the nail. He built it to outlast him. And it did. People in the bottom started calling that little rise Eli's Rise. And the name stuck. And to this day, if you ask anybody in Hartfield where the high ground is, they will point you to Eli's Rise and the Tate House, standing on top of it like it grew there, and over the front door. Eli carved a sign, just 4 words, cut deep into a slab of cypress. And he painted the letters white so you could read them from the road. While I stand, you stand. That was the whole creed. That was Eli Tate's entire theology. His economics. His politics. All 4 words of it. While I stand, you stand. Meaning, as long as this house is dry, this house is yours. As long as I am on my feet, you do not have to be on your knees. Meaning a man's worth is not in what he keeps. A man's worth is in what he keeps standing for other people. Booker grew up under that sign. Booker buried his daddy out of that house. And Booker had spent his whole life trying to be worthy of those 4 words. He had worked the mill. like his father wanted something better for him. But the mill was what there was. 41 years. Booker Tate was a boilermaker and a welder. A good one. One of the best in 3 counties. The kind of man they would call in the middle of the night when a pressure vessel cracked. Because Booker could read steel the way a doctor reads a body. He could lay a weld bead so clean and so true that the younger men used to come around just to watch him work. The way you'd watch a man do calligraphy. For 41 years he gave that mill the strength of his hands and the prime of his life. And when the mill went bankrupt in the Great Consolidation, sold off to a holding company that stripped it for parts and shipped the work overseas. The pension fund went with it. There had been a fund. Booker had paid into it out of every check for 4 decades. And when the bankruptcy was done, and the lawyers had taken their cut, and the executives had taken their bonuses, what was left for the men who had actually done the work was about 11 cents on the dollar. 11 cents. 41 years of a man's life. And the system that wrote the rules paid him back 11 cents on the dollar and called it legal. So that is where Booker Tate was. The winter the river broke. 71 years old. Living on a Social Security check and that gutted little pension. The 2 of them together barely covering the necessities. The roof of his daddy's house had taken damage in the last big storm. 3 years back, a section of the back roof peeled up in the wind. And the rain got in. And there was a water stain on the bedroom ceiling shaped like the state of Florida that grew a little bigger every time it rained. He had patched it the best he could from the inside. But a man can't safely climb up on a roof at 71. And the proper repair cost money he did not have. He had applied for help after that storm. Filled out the federal forms. Filled them out twice. And the help never came to the bottom. It came to the heights. He had watched the contractors' trucks up there, re-roofing houses that had barely lost a shingle, while down in the bottom, where the damage was worst, the trucks never once turned off the main road. And that very week, with the new storm already building out over the Gulf, Booker had swallowed his pride and gone back into that county office one more time. Not even for himself. Really. He had gone to ask, again, about his roof. Yes, but mostly to beg those men to do something for the bottom before the water came. To run the warning down. To drop off sandbags. To send a single truck. And the man behind the desk had been Wendell Garr. And you already know how that went. Garr tore the application in half. And he shoved the coffee cup off the desk. And he told an old man to go drown in his own swamp. 12 hours. That's how long Wendell Garr had. Between saying those words and being proven the smallest man in the state of Mississippi. But here is the thing about Booker Tate. And it is the same thing that was true about his father. And it is the heart of this whole story. None of it ever closed his hands. He kept a generator in the shed. An old, reliable thing he had rebuilt himself. And every storm season he made sure it ran. In case somebody on this rise needed power. He kept the johnboat up in the rafters. Oiled and ready. In case the river came up and somebody couldn't get out. He kept the African Methodist Episcopal Church's furnace running for free. Reverend Coates had given up trying to pay him years ago. He fixed the neighborhood's broken things. Lawnmowers, water heaters, a wheelchair ramp for old Miss Pearline next door, the Mosley family's truck. He didn't charge a dime, and when somebody tried to pay him, he would say the same thing every time. His father's words coming right out of his mouth. While I stand, you stand. Put your money away. 3 afternoons a week. He kept an eye on the Mosley grandbabies after school. Because their grandmother, Miss Cordelia, worked the late shift at the chicken plant 40 minutes away. And there was nobody else. He would sit those children at his kitchen table and feed them cornbread and tell them stories about their great-great-grandparents, who had bought this wet land with freedom, money, and held on to it through everything. And he would tell them about Eli, and the rise, And the 4 words over the door, "You don't have to have much to be worth a lot." He told the oldest Mosley boy once, a serious child named Deshaun, who was always taking things apart to see how they worked. "Worth ain't about what's in your pocket. Worth is about whether somebody is better off because you were here." You remember that. Deshaun remembered it. You will see why that matters later. Now I want you to understand the shape of Booker's days, because it is the shape of the whole man. He woke before 5 every morning, the way he had for 50 years. Not because anything made him, but because that was who he was. He made coffee in a percolator older than most of his neighbors. He sat at the kitchen table in the gray dark, and he talked to Della, Tate, married 38 years. She had been a labor and delivery nurse at the county hospital for 3 decades. Caught more babies out of the women of 3 counties than anyone could count. Half of them black babies, whose mamas trusted Della the way you trust family, because the hospital sure did not give them anybody else to trust. When the hospital consolidated and shut the maternity ward on the bottom side of the county, Della took it personal, because she knew exactly what it meant. It meant a black woman in labor now had an hour's drive to deliver. And Della had seen what an hour can cost. She fought it. She lost. And she never put her nursing bag away. Just in case. All the way up until the cancer took her 9 years back. Fast and unfair. In the front bedroom of the house on the rise, Booker had held her hand in that room and promised her he would keep going. He had kept the promise. Mostly. The house got real quiet after Della. A man can rattle around inside a quiet house and let it hollow him out. And there were nights. Booker would admit if you got him honest. When the quiet won. But mostly he did what his father did and what his wife did. He turned outward. He filled the quiet by filling other people's needs. And he had learned the oldest secret the people of Freedmen's Bottom ever knew. The one their great-grandparents carried up out of slavery itself, that the surest way to carry your own grief is to get up under somebody else's load. That was Booker Tate. Invisible to the county. Invisible to the men who voted down the levy year after year. A name on a stack of denied forms in a filing cabinet somewhere. A man the system had decided, in 1,000 small bureaucratic ways, simply was not worth the cost of saving. The system was about to learn his name. It started as a tropical storm that should have been nothing. The forecasters on the Jackson station said it would make landfall on the coast, weaken over Lont, and rake the region with a day of heavy rain before moving on. A nuisance. A wet weekend, but the storm did not move on. It stalled. A ridge of high pressure to the north sat on it like a hand, and the whole sprawling, soaking mass of it just parked itself over the Cawood River basin. And it rained. Note a nuisance. A faucet that would not shut off. 10 inches the first day. 8 more the second. The ground gave up trying to soak it in. And the water started to run. All of it. Downhill. Toward the river. And the river started to rise. Booker watched the river the way his father taught him. Not by the news, which barely mentioned Hartfield, but with his own eyes and a nail. He had driven a nail into the 3rd piling of the Pratt Street Bridge 60 years ago and repainted its head white every few years. And that nail was his gauge. By Friday evening, the water was a foot under the nail. By Saturday noon, it was at the nail. By Saturday evening, it was over the nail. And Booker stood on the bridge in his slicker with the rain hammering the hood. And he felt something cold go through him that had nothing to do with the weather. He had seen the river come up his whole life. He had never seen it come up like this. He went home and he got ready. The way Eli taught him. He filled every container in the house with clean water in case the pipes went bad. He moved what mattered up high. The photographs. The family Bible with the names of the freed people written in the front in faded ink. His daddy's tools. He pulled the generator out and checked the fuel and ran it for 10 minutes to be sure. And the steady chug of it was almost a comfort. He brought the johnboat down out of the rafters. Set the oars in it. coiled a length of good rope in the bow. He stacked every blanket and quilt in the house by the door. He checked the kerosene in 3 lanterns, and then he did something he could not have explained to you if you had asked. He went to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, and he took out his wife's things. Della's good wool coat, 2 of her heavy sweaters, a stack of her quilts, the warm clothes he had never been able to give away in the 9 years since she passed. Because giving them away felt like saying she was really gone. He carried them all out to the front room and laid them over the back of the sofa. He didn't know why. He stood there a moment looking at them. And he said it out loud. To the empty house. In case somebody comes who needs warming up. He took Della's old nursing bag down off the closet shelf too. And set it by the door. Old habits. Old love. He could not have told you why. He would understand it by morning. Now let me tell you about the sirens. Because this is the part that ought to make you sit up in Hartfield Heights. At 9:40 that Saturday night, the storm sirens went off. Long, rising wails over the high ground. The official county warning that the flood stage was critical and people should move to safety. Up in the heights, where the houses sat 8, 10, 12 feet higher than the bottom, where the levee held the river back, where the water that night would not get within 4 feet of a single front door. Up there, the sirens screamed, and down in the bottom, where the water was already coming up through the storm drains, where in 2 hours people would be standing on their kitchen tables, where the flood that night would put 11 feet of black river water through the heart of the neighborhood. Down there, in Freedmen's Bottom, there was no siren. There had never been a siren. The warning system the county built to save lives reached exactly to the line where the black neighborhood began, and then it stopped. Because running that line the last half-mile had been Phase 2, and Phase 2 never came. And the man who had refused, that very week, to do a single thing about it, was Wendell Garr. So the people of the bottom got no warning. They went to sleep that night the way they had 1,000 nights. And the river came for them in the dark, except for one man, because one man had a nail in a bridge piling in his father's eyes. And Booker Tate did not need a county siren to tell him what the river was about to do. He did not sleep. He sat in his daddy's chair by the window with a lantern turned low and the rain rattling the glass. And he watched the dark, and a little after 1 in the morning he heard it. A sound under the rain. A deep liquid roar that he felt in the floorboards before he heard it in his ears. The roar of a river coming over its banks all at once. Booker stood up. He put on his slicker. He picked up the lantern, and the man went out to meet the flood. By the time Booker got the johnboat off the rise and into the street was not a street anymore. It was a current. The water had come up 3 feet in the time it took him to pull on his boots. And it was rising so fast he could watch it climb the trunks of the pecan trees. Black water, cold for Mississippi, full of mud and gasoline and the broken pieces of people's lives. A child's plastic chair, a propanet tank, a porch swing, all of it moving downstream in the dark. The bottom was waking up to drowning. He could hear it now over the roar. Doors banging. Somebody calling a name over and over. A dog gone out of its mind. Porch lights that should have been on were dark. Because the power was gone. In house after house, families were waking in the dark to water already over their ankles. Already over their knees. With no warning, and nowhere to go, and no way to call for help. Because the towers were down and the lines were dead, Booker put his back into the oars. And he went to work. He went to the Mosleys first. Because of the babies. He found Miss Cordelia and the 3 grandbabies up on the kitchen counters. The water already 2 feet deep in the house. Deshaun holding the littlest one up out of the water with both arms and his face dead calm, even though he was 12 years old. Booker brought the boat right up to the window and they came out one at a time. And he stacked them in the boat under Della's quilts. and he rode them up the rise to his own front porch and put them inside. And he told Deshawn, "You are in charge of keeping these little ones dry and these lanterns lit. Can you do that?" And Deshawn said, "Yes, sir," and meant it. And Booker turned the boat around and went back out into it. He pulled Miss Pearline off her roof. 86 years old. She had climbed out her bathroom window onto the roof in her nightgown when the water came up. And she was sitting up there in the rain, calm as Sunday. Because, she told Booker later, "I figured the Lord or Booker Tate would be along. And either way I would be all right." He brought her in. He pulled the Ortega family out of their pickup truck. They ran the corner store. The Ortegas. The only family in the bottom that wasn't black. And they had tried to drive out when the water rose. And the truck had stalled and filled. And they were standing in the bed of it holding each other when Booker's lantern found them. 4 of them, including a baby. He brought them in, trip after trip. Booker Tate rode out into the worst night that neighborhood had seen in 100 years. And he brought his people up onto the high ground his father built for exactly this. The front room of the Tate house filled up. Miss Cordelia and her grandbabies. Miss Pearline. The Ortegas. The Gibbs family from the corner of Pratt and Fourth. More than 20 souls. Eventually, wet and shaking and praying and alive, all of them wrapped in Della's quilts and Eli's stubbornness. All of them dry. Because one old man would not bar his door, and then, on what he meant to be his last trip, just as the black was starting to gray toward dawn, Booker rode out past the edge of the neighborhood toward the Pratt Street Bridge to check the nail one more time. And he saw headlights, not in the river. Above it, up on the high span of the old bridge, 2 headlights pointed crooked at the sky, and a horn blowing, 3 short blasts, 3 long, 3 short, over and over. The oldest call for help there is, somebody up on that bridge knew it. And somebody up on that bridge was sending it out into the dark and the rain, betting their life that somebody, anybody, would see. Booker saw it. He pointed the johnboat at the bridge. And he rowed. The bridge deck was awash. The river had come up over the roadway itself now. A foot of current ripping straight across the span. And in the middle of it sat a rental sedan. A low silver car, never built for water. Dead in the flood, with the river pouring through it. 3 people were up on the roof and the hood of the car, soaked to the skin. And even from 40 feet out in the dark, Booker could see they were in trouble. A woman crouched on the hood with her right arm held against her body all wrong. A man, her brother, as it would turn out, bracing himself against the windshield. One hand clamped on the collar of a boy. And the boy, 15 years old, sitting on the roof of the car laying on that horn in code. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Because he had learned it in Scouts and it was the only thing he could think to do. The woman had a phone pressed to her ear in her one good hand, screaming into it. And the phone was dead. And had been dead for an hour. And she knew it. And she screamed into it anyway. Because what else do you do? Booker brought the boat in close, fighting the current to keep off the car. How many of you, he called over the roar. 3. The man shouted back. Me sister's hurt. Her wrist. I think it's broke. We hit something under the water. The car just... We couldn't. You are all right now. Booker called. You hear me, you are all right. I am going to bring this boat in. And you are going to come to me one at a time. Slow. The boy first. Don't none of you stand up till I say. Water like this will take you off your feet and you will be gone. He had done this all night. His voice had a steadiness in it that reached people right through their panic. The same steady that used to calm the young welders when a job went wrong. The same steady his father had. The boy came first. sliding off the roof into Booker's hands. And Booker set him low in the middle of the boat. Then the brother. Then the woman. And this was the hard one. Because of her arm, Booker had to take most of her weight himself, an old man with 2 bad knees, lifting a grown woman out of a flood, with the current trying to tear them both downstream. And for 1 bad second, the boat tipped, and the black water came up over the side. And the boy, without being told, grabbed the far rail and leaned out to counterweight it. And the boat steadied. And she was in. "I have got you," Booker said. "I have got all of you. Sit down low and hold on. We are going home." He turned the johnboat out of the current and pointed it back at the one light on the whole flooded landscape. The lantern glow of his daddy's house, up on the rise, shining out through the rain like it had shone through every flood since 1947, and he rowed 3 strangers home. Booker brought the boat up to his own front porch. The water was lapping at the second step now. 11 feet of river standing in the bottom. The rise an island in a black sea. He helped them out and through the door, into the lamplit warmth of the crowded front room, and the woman stopped in the doorway. And she looked at it, more than 20 people, wet and saved, wrapped in quilts on the floor and the furniture, the lanterns making a small gold world against all that black water outside. A pot of something on the gas stove, children asleep against grandmothers, an old woman in a nightgown leading a low hum of a hymn under her breath. A whole drowning neighborhood, gathered up onto one dry island. Alive, because of one man. The woman's name was Vivian Calloway. She was 48 years old. And 3 months earlier, she had been confirmed by the United States Senate as the administrator of Region 4 of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the federal official responsible for disaster response across 8 states of the American Southeast, including the state of Mississippi, including the county of Hartfield, including the neighborhood whose floor she was now standing on, soaked to the bone and shaking, her broken wrist held against her chest. She oversaw a budget of billions of dollars. When she gave an order, governors moved, and every grant dollar that ever flowed, or never flowed, into Wendell Gar's county, flowed through the agency she ran. She was in the machinery of who that country saved when the water came. One of the most powerful people in the South, and nobody in that room had the first idea who she was. Least of all the man who had just pulled her out of the river. To Booker Tate she was a cold, frightened woman who needed warming up. That was all she was. And so that was everything she got. "Come on in out of that doorway," he told her. "Deshawn, get this lady that chair by the stove. The warm spot. Cordelia. We got any of that dry clothes left?" He was already moving. Already reading the room, the way he read steel. Finding the problems in the order of how bad they were. The woman's arm first. "Ma'am, let me see that wrist. I'm all right." Vivian started. The way powerful people always start. "You should help that everybody else in this room is dry and breathing," Booker said. Gentle, but final. "You are the one hurt. Let me see it." She let him see it. And Booker Tate, who had never set a bone in his life, did what his Della would have done. And in fact, the moment he took down her nursing bag from where it sat by the door and opened it on the table, something moved in him. His hands remembering 40 years of watching her do this. He felt the wrist with the pads of his fingers. Careful as reading a weld seam. "It's not through the skin," he said. "Could be broke. Could be a bad sprain. I am no doctor, but we are going to splint it so it can't move. And so it stops hurting you so bad. And come, daylight, we are going to get you to somebody who knows more than me." He took a cedar shingle off the woodpile, patted it with a folded dish towel, and bound her wrist to it with strips torn from a clean bedsheet. Neat. Firm. No wasted motion. The work of a man who had spent his whole life making careful things with his hands. When he was done, the pain had backed off enough that she felt tears come up behind her eyes. And she did not know if it was the pain leaving or something else. There. Booker said, "That will hold." Then he got the brother and the boy into dry clothes. His own things for the man. An old flannel of his for the boy that hung off him like a tent. And for Vivian he brought Della's coat and a heavy sweater. And when he held the coat out to her, something crossed his face. Quick. And was gone. "This was my wife's," he said. "She would want it doing some good." Go on. Vivian Calloway put on a dead woman's coat in the house of a man who had nothing. And she would tell people, later, for the rest of her life, that in all her years of authority and budgets and federal power, she had never once been handed anything that weighed as much as that coat. Then there was the matter of food. Booker had a pot of red beans and rice on the stove. He had put it on that afternoon. Smoked neck bones and a ham hock and a pound of red beans. Meant to last him most of the week. He stood and looked at that pot. And then he looked at the front room full of people. More than 24 now. And Booker Tate did the arithmetic of generosity that his whole life had been one long lesson in. He cut the rice with more rice. He stretched the beans with a can of tomatoes and a can of corn out of the pantry. He mixed up a double skillet of cornbread on the gas stove and baked it golden. And he served it out. Every single soul in that room got a bowl and a square of cornbread. The children first, then the old folks, then the strangers, then everybody, and there were maybe 2 clean bowls left when he was done. And Booker filled neither of them for himself. The boy, his name was Jalen, Vivian's nephew. He noticed, 15 years old and rattled half to death. And still he noticed, because his grandmother had raised him to, "Mista," he said, "ain't you gonna eat? You ought to be at supper." Booker said, which was a lie. And Vivian saw that it was a lie. And something turned over in her chest. For a while the room found a kind of peace. That is a thing that happens. In the worst nights. Once people are dry and fed and the immediate dying has stopped, there comes a strange warm hour where strangers tell each other true things they would never say in daylight. Vivian's brother, Maurice, sat near the stove drying his boots. And he got to talking with Booker the way men do over a quiet job. Maurice was a high school history teacher, down in the same county where he and Vivian had come up. He told Booker about their grandmother, Eula, who they had just buried 2 days before the storm caught them on the road. That was where they had been coming from. The 3 of them, driving back from putting their grandmother in the ground. Eula had cleaned other people's houses for 50 years and raised Vivian and Maurice after their own mother passed. In a low-ground neighborhood that flooded every spring. A place not one bit different from the one they were sitting in now. She would have liked it here, Maurice said, looking around at the lamplit room full of saved people. My grandmother. She would have walked into this house and known exactly where she was. Booker nodded slow. Sounds like good people. The best there was. Maurice said. She used to say the same thing every time the water came up. She would say, "Baby, they put us on the low ground on purpose. But they cannot put us down." He laughed. Soft and sad. 50 years she said that. And here I am. Booker let that sit a moment. Then he said, "Your sister, she is quiet. But she has been watching everything in this room all night. She do that for a living." Maurice glanced over at Vivian, who was sitting by the stove in Della's coat with her splinted arm in her lap, staring into the fire. "Something like that," he said. "She got out. My sister climbed all the way up out of the low ground, higher up than anybody from where we come from ever got." He did not say where. Not yet. He just shook his head. Funny thing about climbing up out, though, you spend the whole climb telling yourself it is so nobody else ever has to, and then one day you look down, and the water is right back where it always was. And the same people are still standing in it. He looked at Booker. I think that is about what she is chewing on over there. Over in the corner, the two boys had found each other. Deshaun Mosley, 12, and Jalen, the nephew, 15. Jalen was showing Deshaun the code he had blown out on the car horn, tapping it on the floor with his knuckles. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, and Deshaun was soaking it up, the way he soaked up everything, taking it apart to see how it worked. 2 boys from 2 low-ground neighborhoods, 2 counties apart, who had both nearly drowned that night, sitting on a dry floor, learning how to send help out into the dark. Booker watched them out of the corner of his eye while he tended the stove, and something in his chest eased. Because that right there, that was the whole point of keeping a house standing. So the children would have somewhere to learn. But here is the part of the night that mattered most. And it is the part nobody planned. Because while Booker Tate moved through that room keeping people alive, Vivian Calloway, the most powerful disaster official in the American Southeast, stranded by a flood inside the very kind of neighborhood her agency was sworn to protect, sat in the warm spot by the stove in a dead woman's coat. And she looked, and she could not stop looking, and everything she saw put the entire machine she sat at the top of on trial. She heard Miss Pearline, 86 years old, tell the Ortega children how she had waited up on her roof, because the county siren don't come down to us. Baby. Never has. So, down here you learn to listen for the river yourself. Vivian had spent 3 months reading reports about siren coverage. She had never once heard it said out loud by a woman who had sat on a roof in the rain because of it. She heard the Mosley grandmother explain, when one of the strangers asked why nobody had evacuated, that there had been no warning. No order. No buses. They don't run the warning down into the bottom. Soon. And there ain't but the one road out. And it goes under first. Vivian had signed off on the regional evacuation framework. She had assumed, the way people at the top assume, that the framework reached everyone. She was sitting now inside the gap in her own framework, the gap shaped exactly like a black neighborhood. She watched, through the front window as the gray came up, the first county rescue boats appear out on the water at dawn, and she watched them go to the heights side first. The heights, where the water had not reached a single door. The official boats, the ones with the radios and the life vests and the budget she controlled, motored right past the drowning bottom to go check on the dry heights. Because that was the route. That was the plan. That was how it had always been done. And nobody in the chain of command had ever once asked why the boats went to the high ground before the low ground, when it is the low ground that floods. And she learned, in pieces, over that long lamplit night. The rest of it, she learned about the levee that protected the heights and stopped where the black neighborhood began. She learned about the 40-year study that never got funded because the cost-benefit numbers did not justify the investment. And she learned, when she finally asked Booker about the water stain shaped like Florida on his bedroom ceiling, that he had applied for federal disaster help 3 years back, after the last storm, and been denied, that the trucks went up to the heights to re-roof houses that had lost a shingle, while the bottom, where the damage was real, got nothing. She was holding a cup of chicory coffee Booker had pressed into her good hand when he told her that, plain, no bitterness in it, just the way a thing is. And then he told her about the man at the desk, that very week, who had torn his application in half and told him to go drown. He did not say it to complain. He said it the way you mention the weather, And Vivian Calloway looked down into that coffee and understood that the man who had just saved her life had been thrown out of an office days ago by the very system she ran, and the last thing she learned that night cut the deepest because of who she was. Vivian Calloway had grown up 2 counties over, in a neighborhood exactly like Freedmen's Bottom. The low ground, the flood ground, the Freedmen's ground. She had cleaned river mud off her own mother's walls as a girl. She had gotten out the way you were supposed to get out, the way they tell you to. School, and more school, and the long, hard climb up through the very institutions that had failed the place she came from, all the way to the top of the agency that was supposed to make sure no child ever again grew up cleaning flood mud off the walls. That was the whole point. That was the entire reason she had given her life to it. And here she sat, at the top of all of it, all the power she had fought for, stranded in a flood, in a neighborhood her own agency had abandoned, kept alive not by the system she had dedicated herself to, but by an old man with a johnboat, and 4 words carved over his door. 4 words she could see from the chair by the stove every time she looked up. While I stand, you stand. She sat with that all night. And somewhere in the small, dark hours, Vivian Calloway stopped being a stranded passenger and started being something else. Because she understood now. Really understood. In her body. In a way no report could ever have taught her. That the difference between this neighborhood living and dying that night had not been her agency. Her agency had let it drown. The difference had been one man's refusal to, and she understood that there were 1,000 neighborhoods like this one, across her 8 states. 1,000 Freedmen's Bottoms, with the warning line stopping at the color line, and that not all of them had a Booker Tate, and that the ones that did not were just waiting their turn to die. She did not say any of this out loud. She just watched the old man move through the room all night, never sitting, never eating, splinting and feeding and reassuring, keeping the generator fed, keeping the lanterns lit, keeping his people standing. And around 4 in the morning, when most of the room had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Vivian watched Booker Tate go quietly to the stove, take down the last of his cornmeal and the last of his buttermilk, and make a fresh double skillet of cornbread and a pot of chicory coffee, so that the more than 24 people sleeping on his floor would have something hot to wake up to. He set it out under a clean towel. Then he sat down in his daddy's chair by the window, and he watched the water, and he waited for the sun. Vivian Calloway, watching him, made a decision that would eventually move billions of dollars and rewrite the rules of who that country saves. But she made it quietly, in the dark, and she did not tell a soul. The sun came up on a drowned world. From the rise you could see the whole bottom underwater, rooftops sticking up out of a brown lake, the tops of the pecan trees, the steeple of the church standing in the flood like the mast of a sunk ship. But the rain had finally stopped. The storm had moved on at last. And the sky over Hartfield was a hard, clean, washed-out blue, the kind of pitiless, beautiful blue that comes after the worst nights. And on that water, a little after 7, came the helicopters, not the county, the state, and then the federal, because somewhere in the night, the National Guard had stood up its flood response, and the state emergency office had escalated to a federal disaster declaration. And out of the chaos, a small fleet of swiftwater rescue teams and helicopters and federal search and rescue crews had finally, belatedly, come for Hartfield, Mississippi, the cavalry, 12 hours late, arriving to find that the bottom had largely already saved itself. Gathered up on one old man's rise, a swiftwater team came up to the Tate house in a hard-bottom boat, 4 responders in dry suits and helmets. Professional. Urgent. The team leader was a young guard lieutenant with a clipboard and a radio. They were doing a count, a triage, getting names. organizing the evacuation of the survivors to the shelter. The Red Cross was standing up at the high school, up in the heights, and the lieutenant came through the door, and he started his count, and he started taking names, and then he stopped because he saw her, sitting by the stove in a dead woman's coat, with her arm in a cedar shingle splint. Soaked and exhausted and unmistakable was the administrator of Region 4. The lieutenant had stood in a briefing room 2 weeks earlier, where this woman had addressed his entire unit on a screen. He knew her face the way a soldier knows the face of the person at the very top of his chain of command. The young man came to attention so fast he nearly dropped the clipboard. Administrator Calloway. His voice cracked on it. "Ma'am, we had you. Your office reported you overdue. Ma'am, we have had teams looking. Are you? God. Ma'am, are you all right?" And the whole room turned and looked at the cold, hurt, frightened woman they had spent the night thinking of as just another soul. Booker pulled out of the river, and Booker Tate, standing by the stove with a coffee cup in his hand, looked at the woman whose wrist he had splinted with a piece of his own woodpile. The woman he had given his dead wife's coat. The woman he had told about his torn-up application over a cup of coffee in the dark. And he watched her become someone else entirely. "I am all right, Lieutenant," Vivian said, standing slowly. "Thanks to this man." She nodded at Booker. "Everyone in this room is all right. Thanks to this man." The lieutenant looked at Booker. Booker looked at Vivian. And Vivian Calloway looked back at Booker Tate. And there was something in her face now that had not been there a moment before. Not gratitude. Exactly. Something fiercer than gratitude. And she said it quietly. Just to him. Under the noise of the radios. "Mr. Tate. The agency that turned down your roof. The agency that never ran the sirens down here. The agency whose own man tore up your paper this week and told you to go drown. The agency that let this whole neighborhood go under last night. Yes. Ma'am," Booker said. "I run it." The old man looked at her for a long moment. And then Booker Tate did something nobody expected. He did not get angry. He did not get bitter. He just nodded. Slow. And a little of the tired left his eyes. And what came up in their place was something closer to hope than anybody in that room had seen in a long time. "Well, then," Booker said, "I expect you have got some work to do." "Yes. Sir," said the most powerful disaster official in the American Southeast. To the man who had saved her life. "I expect I do. Here is what most people get wrong about a story like this. They think the moment of justice is the moment the powerful person finds out who the little person really is. They think it is the reveal, the salute, the I run it. It is not. That is just the moment the work begins. What Vivian Calloway did over the next year was not gratitude. And it was not charity. And it sure was not a check written to make a guilty conscience feel better. It was something the people in the bottom had been waiting 150 years for. It was accountability. And it was reform. And it started about an hour after that helicopter lifted her off Eli's Rise. She refused the hospital first. Made them treat her wrist at the field station. It was a bad sprain. Not a break. Booker's instinct had been right. And then, instead of letting them fly her home, she had them set up a command post at the Hartfield High School, and she ran the federal response to that flood herself. On the ground, in the mud, for 2 straight weeks. She did not delegate it. The administrator of Region 4 stood in the parking lot of that high school in borrowed boots and directed the recovery of a neighborhood she had spent one night inside. And the response that Freedmen's bottom got was unlike any response it had ever gotten in its history. Because for the first time, the person running it had personally watched it nearly die. You could see the difference in 100 small things. And the people of the bottom noticed every single one of them. The supply trucks came down into the low ground first. For once, instead of staging up in the dry heights and trickling down whatever was left, the temporary housing units actually got delivered to the bottom this time, not deferred to a phase 2 that never came. When a county official tried to route the first wave of cleanup crews back up to the heights out of pure habit, Vivian turned them around herself. In the parking lot, in front of everybody, and sent them down into the flood zone, where the work actually was. And she did one thing nobody could remember ever happening before. She went door to door, the head of the whole federal region, walking the muddy streets of Freedmen's Bottom in rubber boots, knocking on the doors of people who had been knocking on her agency's door for 100 years and getting no answer. Asking them what they needed. Booker walked some of those streets with her. The two of them, the old welder and the administrator, and the people came out onto their ruined porches and looked at the two of them together like they were seeing something that was not supposed to be possible. But the response was the easy part. The reckoning came next. Vivian ordered a full federal after-action investigation. Not the usual quiet internal review that gets filed and forgotten, but a real one, with subpoena power, into a single question. Why did Freedmen's Bottom have no flood protection, no warning system, and no prior disaster aid? When the neighborhood half a mile away had all three, the investigation took 8 months. And what it dug up out of that county's own filing cabinets became, when it was finally made public, a national story. Because it was not a story about Hartfield. It was a story about how it is done everywhere. They found the memos, 40 years of them. They found the cost-benefit analyses that had justified protecting the heights and deferring the bottom. And they found, in black and white, that the deferrals were calculated on property value, that a federal formula, applied for decades, had quite literally weighed the houses in the black neighborhood, found them cheap, and concluded that the lives inside them were not worth the cost of a levy, not because anybody in particular hated anybody, because the formula said so, because the math of who gets saved had been written a long time ago, to save the people who already had the most, and nobody had ever made it stop. They found the siren plans, with the line stopping at the color line. Year after year, phase 2, pending funding that always went somewhere else, and they found the name of the man who, more than anybody, had kept it that way, Wendell Gar. For 22 years, the county's emergency management director, the man who wrote the hazard mitigation plans, and ranked the projects, and authored the deferrals. The man who, that very week, had torn an old man's application in half and told him to go drown. The investigation found that Gar had personally rerouted 2 separate federal grants that could have extended the warning system down into the bottom, rerouted them to drainage improvements up in the heights, and had then certified to the federal government that the county's warning coverage was, quota, comprehensive. Now here is the irony. And it is the kind of irony that ought to give you chills. The warning Wendell Gar diverted away from the bottom to the half-mile of siren line he killed, so the money could go protect the high ground. That was the exact warning that never sounded the night the river came. Which means the negligence of the man who threw Booker Tate out of his office was the same negligence that put 11 feet of water through that neighborhood. Which means it nearly drowned everybody in it. Which means it nearly drowned Vivian Calloway herself. The woman at the top of the entire agency Wendell Gar answered to, and the only reason it did not, the only reason Gar's own ultimate boss did not die on the roof of a sinking car in the dark, was a johnboat and a lantern, and the exact same old man Wendell Gar had treated like garbage 12 hours before. That last part, the false certification, that was a federal crime. You can be callous in America, and it is legal. The formula protects you, but you cannot lie to the federal government on a grant certification. Wendell Garr was removed from his position, and he was referred for prosecution, and the measured, lawful weight of it came down on him, not as revenge, but as the simple closing of a door that should have closed 20 years before. Now, understand, this is the part that matters. So let me say it plain. The point was never Wendell Garr. Firing one man does not drain the bottom. There would always be another Wendell Garr. As long as the formula said the bottom was not worth saving, the reckoning that mattered was not the man. It was the formula, and Vivian Calloway went after the formula. She took everything the investigation found. The memos, the deferrals, the property value math, the line that stopped at the color line, and she carried it all the way up. She testified before Congress. Her wrist healed by then, in a hearing room full of cameras, and she did not give them the careful, hedged, bureaucratic testimony they were expecting from a sitting administrator. She told them a story instead. She told them about a night she spent stranded in a flood. On a rise of high ground, a freedman's grandson had been protecting his whole life. She told them about an old welder who had come out into the worst water in a century in a johnboat and pulled 24 people off their roofs, including her. She told them she had run the numbers her whole career, and that she had believed, the way people at the top believe, that the numbers were neutral, that the formula was just math. And she told them what it had felt like to sit in that man's house and realize that the formula had weighed his neighborhood, found the houses cheap, and quietly decided that the lives inside them were not worth the cost of a wall. There was a man in that neighborhood, she said, into the record of the United States government, who applied to my agency for help after a storm, and was denied, whose application was torn in half, days before the flood, by a county official who told him to go drown. And then that same man pulled me out of the water, and gave me his dead wife's coat to keep me warm, and fed me out of a pot meant for one, and never asked me for a single thing. She held up a photograph then. Somebody had taken it at dawn. The morning after, a photograph of 4 words carved deep into a slab of cypress over a front door. He has these words over his door. She said, his father carved them in 1947. While I stand, you stand. That old man understood something my entire agency had forgotten. He understood that you do not weigh a human life by what the house is worth. The room was very quiet. She let it stay quiet for 100 years. Vivian said, we have run a system that decides who gets the levy, and who gets the warning, and who the rescue boats reach first. And we have let that system be governed by property value, which means we have let it be governed by everything that put the property value where it is, which means, in plain English, that we built a machine that saves the people who already have the most, and lets the same neighborhoods drown. The same neighborhoods, generation after generation. And we called it math. And we filed the paperwork. And we slept just fine. I will not administer that machine for one more flood season. Not after the night I just told you about. And out of all of it came the thing that made this more than a story about one neighborhood. They called it the Equal Ground Rule. A federal directive, with Vivian's name on the order, and Booker's creed quoted right there in the preamble, requiring that disaster, mitigation, and relief resources be allocated by risk to human life and human need, not by property value, not by historical pattern, not by which neighborhoods had always gotten the levy before. The warning has to reach everyone. The protection has to reach everyone. And the boats, at first light, go to the people in the water before they go to the people who are dry. It sounds simple. It sounds like it should always have been the rule. The reason it was not, for 100 years, is the whole reason this story needed telling. Vivian drove out to Hartfield to tell Booker about it before it was public. She found him in the welding bay of a half-built workshop down by the river, a hood pushed up on his forehead, and she stood in the doorway and read him the preamble. Read him his own father's 4 words, coming back to him out of a federal directive, and Booker Tate set down his torch and listened to the whole thing. And when she was done, he was quiet, a long moment. My daddy carved those words for one house. He said, finally, one rise, so a few of his neighbors would not drown. He looked at her, and you went and put them over the whole country. You put them there. Mr. Tate, Vivian said. I just wrote them down. Booker shook his head. Slow. No. Ma'am, he said. I kept one house standing. That is all a man gets to do. You are the one who took it and made it stand for everybody. That ain't nothing. That is the part my daddy never got to see. And his voice caught on it. Just for a second. The only time in this whole story that anybody saw it catch. And he turned back to his bench so she would not see his face. And Vivian Calloway had the grace to let him, but the law in Washington was only half of it. The other half happened back home. In the mud. And it happened the way Booker Tate would have wanted it. Not done to the bottom. Done by it. The levee came first. Within the year, the Army Corps was back in Hartfield. And this time the levee did not stop where the heights ended. This time it ran on. The last half mile. Around the whole of Freedmen's Bottom. Closing the gap that had stood open for 100 years. Booker Tate walked that levee line the day they staked it out. An old man with 2 bad knees. Walking the length of the protection his neighborhood had been denied since before he was even born. And when he got to the end of it, to the place where the old levee used to just stop, he stood there a long while and did not say anything. And the young Corps engineer walking with him had the good sense not to fill the silence. The sirens went up next. Rialones. On tall pole. All through the bottom. Wired into the same system as the heights. Tested the first Saturday of every month. So everybody could hear that the warning. Finally, reached all the way down. The homes got rebuilt. And not the way the heights had gotten rebuilt after a shingle blew off. But properly, the bottom's houses raised up on piers. The way Eli Tate had raised his back in 1947, because it turned out the old Pullman porter had been 100 years ahead of the engineers. Booker's own roof got fixed. The water stain shaped like Florida finally painted over. He stood under his own dry ceiling the first hard rain after, and listened to it not get in. And he talked to Della's picture. And he talked to his daddy's sign. And he did not have words for it. So he did not use any. And here is the part that would have meant the most to Eli. The part that made Booker Tate weep the one time anybody saw him do it. The rebuilding needed welders, boilermakers, people who could raise a house up on piers and lay a clean weld and read steel. Exactly the trade that the closed mill had thrown away. Exactly the skill the system had decided was not worth a pension. And Vivian Calloway, who had learned by then that the surest way to protect a place is to give the place the means to protect itself. Helped stand up a training program right there in Hartfield. In a rebuilt warehouse down by the river, a trade corps, free tuition. They taught welding and pipe fitting and elevated construction to the young people of the bottom and the surrounding counties, to kids who, like Booker once was, had nothing in their pockets and everything in their hands. They named it the Eli Tate Trade Corps, and they asked Booker to teach, so that is where you would have found Booker Tate. A year after the flood, 72 years old now, both knees still shot, standing in a welding bay with a hood pushed up on his forehead, leaning over a young person's shoulder, watching them lay a bead, saying the thing his father said, the thing he had said to the Mosley boy at the kitchen table all those years ago. Worth ain't about what is in your pocket. Worth is about whether somebody is better off because you were here. Now run that beat again. Slower. And let me see you do it right. The first class had 11 students. One of them was Deshaun Mosley. The boy Booker had pulled off a kitchen counter, holding his baby cousin up out of the water. He was 13 now, and he still took everything apart to see how it worked. And he had decided, the night of the flood, watching an old man build dry ground for a whole neighborhood. Exactly what kind of man he was going to be. They mounted a sign over the door of the trade corps. Booker carved it himself, out of cypress, cut it deep, and painted the letters white, the way his daddy taught him. While I stand, you stand. The 4 words came down off one old door over the river, and they went up over a building full of young people learning to build the high ground. Their grandparents were never given. That is not a check. That is not charity. That is a creed. Jumping a generation. That is the thing this whole story was always actually about. The storms come every year. That is the thing about the river. You do not beat it. You just decide, every season, whether you are going to be ready for it. A year and some after the flood, almost to the season, another storm came up the basin out of the Gulf, smaller than the one that broke the banks, but bad enough, the kind of slow, soaking storm that stalls and rains and brings the river up toward the nail in the bridge piling. But this time, something was different in Freedmen's Bottom. This time, when the river came up critical, the sirens went off. All of them, on both sides of town at once. The high ground and the low ground together. The warning reaching every door it had skipped for 100 years. Screaming its head off over a neighborhood that, for the first time in its history, was being told, in time, that the water was coming, and this time, there was a levee. The river came up and pushed against the new wall that ran all the way around the bottom now. And the wall held, and the water stayed in the river where it belonged. And the homes of Freedmen's Bottom stayed dry. And this time, when a family got caught out on the river road in the dark, a young mother and her 2 children, a stalled car, the current rising around the tires, the children crying. This time it was not one old man with one johnboat against the whole flood. This time the warning had gone out, and the new emergency plan had stood up, and the Bottom's own response, trained, organized, ready, was already on the water, and the person who came for that stranded family, who brought the boat through the dark to the stalled car, and reached down with both hands, and said, in a steady voice that calmed them right through their panic, "You are all right now. You hear me? I have got you. Sit down low and hold on. We are going home." That person was a 16-year-old boy named Deshaun Mosley, Booker Tate's student, Booker Tate's neighbor. The boy Booker pulled out of the water with both his little cousins, learning the words at the old man's shoulder, and passing them on down the line. "I have got you. We are going home." Booker watched it from the levee. He had come down to the river when the sirens went off, the way he always would. An old man in a slicker, who could not keep himself from coming to the water when the water came up. And he stood on the new wall his neighborhood had finally been given. And he watched a boy he had taught bring strangers home out of the dark. And he felt his daddy standing right next to him. And his Della. And the whole long line of people who had bought this wet land with freedom, money, and held it through everything. And he understood that he had done the one thing a man is given to do. He had kept it standing. And he had taught somebody else to keep it standing after him. Vivian Calloway was there too. That night, she had come back to Hartfield more than once over the year. And not anymore as the official who had been saved, but as something nearer to family. She had put Booker's creed into a federal directive, and Booker's neighbor into a boat, and she stood next to them. And neither of them said much, because there was not much that needed saying. But after a while, Vivian did speak. She had brought news. The equal ground rule had spread past her region. Other administrators had taken it up. And then the agency itself. And then it had become, quietly, the way the whole country was starting to decide who gets the levy, and who gets the warning, and who the boats go to first. Hundreds of neighborhoods, 1,000 freedmen's bottoms, all over the South and beyond, getting their sirens run the last half mile, getting their levees closed, getting weighed by the worth of the lives inside them. Instead of the price of the houses, it started here, Vivian said, watching the boy's boat come back toward the rise with the family safe inside it. You know that, Mr. Tate. All of it started on your porch. And Booker Tate, 72 years old, both knees gone, the rain coming down on the hood of his slicker, looked out at the dark water and the one boat bringing people home. And he said the only thing there ever was to say. The 4 words his father carved over a door in 1947, the 4 words that had outlasted the mill, and the flood, and the formula, and would outlast Booker too, because he had made sure of it. While I stand, Booker said. You stand. The boat came up onto the rise. The family came in out of the water, alive, and somewhere up the line, in a dozen states, the warning was reaching the last half mile, and the boats were going to the low ground first, and the high ground that one black man's father built by hand was finally, being built for everybody. That is where the water leaves it. One old man, one creed, one neighborhood that saved itself, and a country, slow and late and 100 years overdue, finally learning to count every life as worth saving. I am not going to lie to you. This one sat on my chest for a while, because think about what Booker Tate actually was. On paper, a retired welder, the system robbed of his pension, a man whose own government turned down his roof, a man who got cussed out and thrown out of a county office days before a flood, told to go drown in his own swamp by a little man behind a desk. Invisible. The kind of man the math is built to overlook, and when the worst night in 100 years came down on his people, that invisible man pulled a boat off the rafters and went out into the flood and saved every soul he could reach. And then he handed the most powerful disaster official in the South a dead woman's coat and a bowl of beans, and never once asked her for a thing. That is the part that gets me. He did not do it for a reward. He did not know she was anybody. He did it because his daddy carved 4 words over a door, and Booker spent his whole life trying to be worthy of them. And it was because he asked for nothing that everything changed. Not just for him, but for 1,000 neighborhoods that finally got their warning run, the last half mile. So let me leave you with the question Booker leaves me with. Who is invisible to you? Who is the person the math overlooks? The one the formula deferred to phase 2. And what would happen if you decided, like Booker did, that while you stand, they stand too? If this one moved you, hit that like button, share it with somebody who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe, because these stories are out there, on the high ground and the low ground both. And the only thing we have to do is keep telling them. Stay dry out there, and keep your door open.